Walk into any drugstore today and you will find an entire wall dedicated to hygiene. There are 18 kinds of deodorant, facial cleansers sorted by skin type, dry shampoos in 4 scents, micellar water, toner, body mist, and products that claim to do things women in the 1950s never thought to ask for. Hygiene has become a category, a purchase, sometimes a personality. And somewhere in the middle of all that choice, the original meaning of it got lost. For the 1950s, American housewife, hygiene was not self-care. It was not a morning ritual she looked forward to, a wellness trend she read about in a magazine, or a reward she gave herself after a hard week. It was the most basic form of social standing she had access to. Her cleanliness, her body, her breath, her clothing, her home, was the first thing the world read about her, and the world was reading constantly. She did not have the luxury of a bad hygiene day. Not because she was vain, and not because she had more time than modern women do. She had less time, fewer products, smaller bathrooms, and harder physical work. What she had instead was an understanding, absorbed from her mother, her neighbors, her church, her culture, that a woman who let her standards slip was not just making a personal choice. She was sending a message, and the people around her would receive it clearly. This was the social contract of mid-century American femininity. Hygiene was currency for these women. And like any currency, its value only held as long as everyone agreed to take it seriously. If this kind of forgotten knowledge is something you want more of, the practical systems, the unspoken rules, the habits that women pass down without ever writing them in a book, subscribe before we go further. And tell me where you are watching from, whether you are in a small town in the American South, somewhere in the Midwest, or watching from another country entirely. I want to know, did the women in your family have a standard like this? A rule about how you left the house, or how the home had to smell before anyone came through the door? Drop it in the comments. Now, what did that daily baseline actually look like? Before the 1950s, housewife opened her front door. Whether she was stepping out to hang laundry, receive a neighbor, walk to the corner store, or simply collect the morning paper, she had already completed a set of tasks that most people today would not think of as hygiene at all. They were too quiet, too quick, too ordinary, but they were non-negotiable. The morning wash came first, not a shower with a shower gel collection lined up along the ledge, a washcloth, a bar of soap, warm water from the tap, and attention. She washed her face, her neck, under her arms, and her hands. She did it quickly and she did it well. Cold cream from the night before had already done its work, removing what the day had put on her skin, softening what the weather had roughened. The washcloth was her tool. The basin was her space. The whole thing took minutes. Her hair was managed, not performed. Pin curls set the night before meant waves were already in place. A brush, a quick set with her fingers, and the hair was done. On the days she washed it, which was not every day because daily washing was not the standard, and her hair's natural oils were considered useful rather than embarrassing, she planned for it. Washing day was a scheduled thing, not a reaction to feeling grimy. Her breath received attention before she spoke to anyone. Tooth powder or toothpaste, water, and a moment at the sink. Women of that era understood that breath was the first thing a person noticed in close conversation. And close conversation happened constantly. At the fence line with a neighbor, across a shop counter, at the church door, in a kitchen where another woman had stopped by. Her hands told a story she was aware of. Housework was physical. Dishes, scrubbing, wringing laundry, handling raw meat, sweeping. Hands got rough and red and stained. So hands were tended, lotion kept near the sink. Nails kept clean and short, cuticles managed. Not manicured in any expensive sense, but kept. Kept was the word that governed most of what she did. Not perfect, kept. Her clothing passed a standard before it went on her body. If a dress had been worn the day before, it had been aired overnight on a hanger near an open window. She knew which garments could be worn twice and which could not. Undergarments were washed daily without question. The apron went on the moment she started cooking or cleaning, and it came off before she answered the door. The apron was a tool. What she wore underneath it was a presentation. All of this, the washcloth, the cold cream, the set hair, the tended hands, the aired dress, happened before 8 in the morning. It happened while the children needed their breakfast, and her husband needed his shirt found, and the kitchen needed the first reset of the day. It was not done in silence and solitude with a candle burning. It was done quickly in a small bathroom, with the sounds of a household already moving around her. She was not doing it for herself in the modern sense of that phrase. She was doing it because the day was about to begin. Other people were about to see her, and the standard was the standard. She had grown up watching her mother do the same thing. She expected her daughter would too. What kept that standard in place was not discipline in the motivational poster sense. It was something quieter and more social than that. It was the knowledge that the neighborhood was watching, not with cruelty but with attention. And attention, in the world she lived in, carried weight. That weight will become clearer when you understand who exactly was watching, what they were looking for, and what it meant when a woman's standard slipped in front of them. The 1950s American housewife did not live in private. She lived in a neighborhood, and the neighborhood was a system. It had rhythms, it had eyes. It had women who noticed when the curtains had not been opened by 9 in the morning, who registered a sour smell at the back door, who took note of a house dress worn too many days in a row. None of this was written down anywhere. It did not need to be. Every woman who lived inside that system understood it without being told. This was the judgment network, not a gossip ring in the mean-spirited sense, though gossip certainly moved through it. It was more like a social fabric held together by shared standards. The women on a given street were each other's audience, each other's comparison point, and in a strange way, each other's accountability. A woman who kept her standards kept her standing. A woman who let them slip was noticed, quietly, quickly, and with a memory that lasted. The network operated in ordinary moments. It was the neighbor who stopped by mid-morning and registered whether the kitchen smelled clean, or whether it held last night's grease and this morning's dishes. It was the women at church who could tell, from 2 pews away, whether your hair had been washed and set, or simply pinned up to hide the fact that it had not. It was the mothers at school pickup who observed the state of your clothing, your hands, your children's cleanliness, and drew conclusions about the whole household from those details. A housewife who smelled of perspiration at a Tuesday morning errand was not just a woman who had a hard morning. She was a woman whose home management was in question. A woman whose breath carried the previous night's dinner into a conversation was not just someone who forgot to brush. She was someone whose attention to detail, to the small, disciplined acts that kept a home and a person running, was visibly slipping. These were the conclusions the network drew. She knew it drew them. That knowledge shaped her daily routine as much as any personal preference ever did. It is worth being plain about something here. This system was not fair. Women carried the full weight of a social standard that men were not measured by in the same way. A man could come home from work tired and rough-edged, and it reflected nothing on his household. A woman who answered her own door in an unwashed house dress and day-old hair was communicating failure. That was the deal she had not chosen, but could not exit. Acknowledge it honestly, because the hygiene habits of this era cannot be understood apart from the pressure that produced them. And yet, within that pressure, something was being built. The women who maintained those standards were not simply performing for the network. They were practicing a form of competence that was entirely their own. The neighborhood could observe the results. Only she knew the systems behind them. The home's cleanliness was inseparable from her personal hygiene. This is the part that modern thinking tends to separate, but the 1950s housewife did not separate them at all. Her home smelled like her. The kitchen carried her habits. The bathroom reflected her standards. If the sink had a ring of soap scum and the towels smelled stale, that was her. If the hallway caught a visitor's nose with something warm and clean, good soap, aired linen, a hint of whatever she had been cooking, that was also her. Women of that era understood this connection at a practical level. The house was an extension of the body. Both had to be maintained on the same daily rhythm. You did not scrub yourself clean and leave the bathroom smelling of mildew. You did not press your dress and leave the kitchen floor sticky underfoot. The standard was one standard, applied everywhere. This meant that hygiene was never just a personal act. Washing her face in the morning was connected to wiping down the bathroom mirror before anyone else used it. Tending her hands was connected to keeping the dish towels clean and dry. Airing her dress overnight was connected to the habit of opening windows in the morning to move old air out of the house. These were not separate routines. They were one system, operating in every room at once, and she ran it. Did your mother or grandmother have an unspoken rule about how the house had to smell before anyone came over? A specific scent from a cleaning product, a candle, something on the stove? Drop it in the comments. Those details tell you everything about how seriously women took this connection between themselves and the space they kept. The Judgment Network made that connection official. If your home smelled right and you smelled right, you were managing. If either one slipped, the conclusion was the same. Something in the household was not under control. And for a woman whose household was the primary measure of her competence, that conclusion had real weight. What is striking, looking back at this from the outside, is how much these women accomplished with almost nothing. The social pressure was real, the network was always watching, and the standard was high. But the tools available were a bar of soap, a washcloth, some baking soda, a bottle of white vinegar, and a cold cream jar that lasted for weeks. There were no elaborate products propping up that level of cleanliness. There was only method, consistency, and the knowledge of exactly what each simple thing was supposed to do. That knowledge, what to use, when to use it, how little you actually needed, was its own form of expertise. And it is the part of this story that has been almost completely lost. She did not walk into a store and choose from 40 products. She walked into a small bathroom, opened one cabinet, and worked with what was there. And what was there was almost nothing by modern standards. A bar of soap, a jar of cold cream, a tin or box of baking soda, a bottle of white vinegar somewhere in the kitchen, a clean washcloth folded on the edge of the sink. That was the kit, the simple essentials of her daily routine. That was what kept her clean, her skin managed, her hair maintained, and her clothing fresh enough to pass the standards of the network she lived inside. The methods were not folk remedies in the romantic sense. They were not passed down as secrets or whispered between women like precious knowledge. They were ordinary. They were practical. They were what worked when you had no other option. Generations of women used them not out of nostalgia, but out of habit and result. Cold cream was the anchor of her skincare. It went on at night, worked through sleep, and came off in the morning with a washcloth. It removed makeup, softened skin, and functioned as a moisturizer all at once. Women did not think of it as a luxury. It was a tool, the way a sponge is a tool. The jar sat on the vanity and was used until it was empty, then replaced. No 7-step routine was needed. The cream did its job, and the face was ready for the day. Baking soda handled what modern products have built entire deodorant empires around. Applied lightly under the arms after the morning wash, it neutralized odor through chemistry simple enough that it required no explanation. Women who used it knew it was not a 48-hour shield. It was a daily solution that required daily application. That was not a flaw in the system. That was the system. You did it every morning the same way you washed your face every morning. Not because you were inspired to, but because it was the next thing you did. White vinegar moved between the kitchen and the laundry without needing a label change. In the wash, it cut through soap residue and left fabric softer and with less odor than it had gone in with. As a final rinse for hair, diluted with water, poured over after washing, then rinsed out, it smoothed the hair shaft, reduced buildup, and left hair with a shine that no product had manufactured. Women whose hair always seemed to behave were often doing something this simple that they had learned from their mothers, and never thought to explain to anyone outside the household. The daily sink wash was not an inferior version of a shower. It was a deliberate practice. Warm water, soap, washcloth, face, neck, underarms, hands. It addressed what needed addressing, and it did so quickly. On days when a full wash was not possible, it was the minimum that kept the baseline intact. Women who grew up in households without indoor plumbing or with one bathroom shared between 6 people understood that a complete wash did not require complete submersion. It required attention and a clean cloth. Hand care was constant and quiet. Hands were in water, in cleaning products, in raw food, in dirt from the garden. They got rough. Lotion kept near the kitchen sink, not an expensive formula. Often something plain and functional like Jergens or a similar basic cream was applied after washing up, before sitting down, before bed. Nails were filed short because long nails caught grease and were impractical for the work she was doing. They were kept clean, not for appearance alone, but because dirty nails at the dinner table or in a neighbor's kitchen said something she did not want said. The clothing hygiene system was its own discipline. She owned fewer garments than most people keep in a single drawer today, and she cared for each one accordingly. A dress worn for a regular day of housework was not washed after one wearing. It was aired, hung near an open window or outside on a dry day, left to breathe overnight, checked in the morning. If it passed, no visible soil, no absorbed odor, it went back on the hanger and was worn again. Washing too frequently wore fabric out faster, and fabric cost money she was careful with. Undergarments were different. Those were washed daily without exception. Slips, brassieres, girdles, stockings. These were rinsed or hand-washed each evening and hung to dry overnight. They were ready again by morning. The discipline was so built into the routine that it required no decision-making. It was as automatic as turning off the kitchen light before bed. The apron was a hygiene tool as much as a practical one. It went on before cooking and cleaning and came off before the front door opened or before she sat at the table. It caught what the dress could not afford to catch: grease, flour, water, food splatter. The apron absorbed it. The dress underneath stayed presentable. This was not elegance for its own sake. It was resource management. The dress had to last. The apron could be washed far more roughly and far more often. Which of these would you actually bring back? The cold cream routine, the vinegar rinse, the daily hand lotion at the kitchen sink, the apron as armor. Drop it in the comments. Some of these habits are so simple that the only thing stopping anyone from using them today is that nobody thought to pass them forward. That is the part that sits quietly underneath all of it. These methods worked. They were cheap, effective, and built around daily consistency rather than expensive intervention. They were not lost because something better replaced them. They were lost because the women who used them stopped being asked what they knew. And eventually there was no one left in the kitchen to show the next generation how little you actually needed to get it right, and what it cost those women to get it right. That is the part of this story that deserves its own honest accounting. The standard was not chosen. That is the first thing to say plainly before anything else about it. The 1950s housewife did not wake up one morning and decide that her cleanliness would be the measure of her household's respectability, that her body would carry the social weight of her family's standing, that the smell of her kitchen and the state of her hands would be read as evidence of her character. She inherited that arrangement. It was already in place when she arrived. The neighborhood had agreed to it before she moved in. The church had ratified it before she joined. Her mother had lived inside it before her, and her mother's mother before that. She was clean because she had to be. That sentence sounds simple. It is not. It means that the daily baseline, the morning wash, the tended hands, the aired dress, the baking soda, the vinegar, the cold cream, none of it was purely personal. All of it was social obligation dressed in the language of personal habit. Her body was not entirely her own. It was a surface that other people read, judged, and drew conclusions from. And those conclusions extended outward from her body, into her home, into her children, into her husband's reputation at work, into the family's position on the street. A woman whose hygiene slipped was not simply a tired woman having a hard week. She was a woman whose household was visibly losing its grip. That was the conclusion the network drew. It did not ask what else was happening. It did not consider that she might be unwell, or grieving, or stretched beyond what any person could reasonably manage. It observed the surface and delivered its verdict. She knew this. She had grown up knowing it, so she maintained the surface, even when the effort behind it was invisible and the cost of it was real. That cost was not small. The pressure to keep every standard, every day, with no acknowledged difficulty, inside a domestic role that had no formal hours and no days off, wore on women in ways the era did not give them language to describe. The home was her workplace, her social identity, and her primary measure of worth, all at once, all the time. Hygiene was only one thread in that fabric, but it was one of the most visible. Letting it go, even slightly, felt like letting go of everything. So she did not let it go. For many women, that pressure became its own kind of confinement. The neighbor's eyes were not always friendly. The standard was not always applied with generosity. There were women who used the hygiene code to establish hierarchy, to mark who belonged and who was struggling, to make social distance feel like a reasonable response. To a woman whose curtains stayed closed, or whose children arrived at school with yesterday's clothes. The system that created order also created judgment. And not everyone caught on the wrong side of it had simply failed to try. This is the part of the story that blind nostalgia skips. The 1950s housewife who always smelled right and kept a clean home, and presented herself and her household without visible strain, was often doing so at a cost that nobody counted. Her competence was expected, her effort was invisible, her expertise was assumed to be instinct rather than skill. Nobody gave her credit for knowing exactly how much baking soda to use, or how to get a grass stain out of cotton without ruining the fabric, or how to air a dress overnight so it came back fresh in the morning. That was just what women did. That was just how it was. And yet, inside all of that pressure, inside the obligation and the surveillance and the unasked-for contract, something real was being built. She knew her body, she knew her home, she knew her tools, her rhythms, her materials, and her methods. With an intimacy that came from daily practice and careful attention, she had agency in the space where she was permitted to have it, and she used that agency with a precision that deserves more respect than it has received. The cold cream was hers. The vinegar rinse was hers. The knowledge of how to keep fabric alive longer than it should have lasted, how to make a bar of soap go further, how to wash hair with less and have it look like more, that was hers. Not the culture's, not the neighborhood's, hers. Learned from her mother, refined in her own kitchen and bathroom, passed forward when her daughter was old enough to stand beside her at the sink and watch. That transmission, mother to daughter, hand to hand, washcloth to washcloth, is where the real loss lives. Not in the products that disappeared or the routines that faded, but in the conversations that stopped happening. The generation that knew these things grew old in a world that had stopped asking. The daughters were busy. The granddaughters had their own product aisles to navigate. The knowledge sat in the hands of women who were no longer being watched by the right people. And then it was gone. What is left is the outline of a system that was practical, pressured, and real. It kept women capable inside conditions that were hard, with tools that were genuinely simple. Not a paradise, but a record worth reading carefully. Picture a small bathroom at dawn. A woman at the mirror, doing what she did yesterday and would do tomorrow. The routine is not glamorous, it is steady, and in that daily act was a competence deeper than the era acknowledged. The daily, unspectacular act of keeping a home to a standard that nobody thanked her for. If this forgotten knowledge matters to you, subscribe before you go. These stories belong to women who deserved more credit than they got.